The winter of 2018 in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana was not just cold, it was malicious. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero before Thanksgiving and stayed there, locking the landscape in a suffocating grip of ice and packed snow. In the isolated logging community of Oak Haven, survival was measured in cords of split wood and gallons of liquid propane. When Clara Hayes, a quiet woman in her late 60s, with silver-streaked hair and a frail frame, purchased the derelict cabin at the end of Pine Ridge Road, the locals quietly assumed she wouldn't make it to spring. The structure was a remnant of the 1950s, a single-room shack built by a defunct timber company. It had single-pane windows, a sagging porch, and most dangerously no chimney. There was no wood stove, no fireplace, and no exterior bulk tank for propane. When the first blizzard hit in early December, dumping 3 feet of snow overnight, the town's residents braced themselves to find her frozen in her bed. But she wasn't. In fact, Clara Hayes was the warmest person in Oak Haven. Mason Paul lived a quarter of a mile down the ridge from Clara. A retired mechanic and a lifelong Montana resident, Mason was a man who understood the brutal mathematics of winter. He spent his summers felling dead wood and his autumns splitting it. By November, he had a wall of firewood 8 feet high and 40 feet long. Every morning, Mason would step onto his porch, breath pluming like dragon smoke in the sub-zero air, and look up the hill toward Clara's cabin. He expected to see frost riming the inside of her glass panes. He expected to see her huddled in a parka. Instead, he saw something that defied the laws of physics. While Mason's roof groaned under a heavy blanket of snow, the shingles on Clara's cabin were bare. The snow didn't just slide off, it melted. A perfect wet perimeter surrounded her foundation, exposing the muddy earth while the rest of the world was buried in white. There was no smoke rising from a chimney, no thrum of a diesel generator, and no heavy electrical lines leading to the property, just the standard, low-voltage residential wires strung from the county road. Mason's confusion quickly soured into an obsession. "I'm telling you, Sarah, it ain't natural," Mason said one morning at the local diner, nursing a cup of black coffee. He leaned over the counter towards Sarah Jenkins, the town's postmaster. "A house don't just stay warm on good intentions. She ain't chopped a single log. She don't have a gas line. Yet, I looked through my binoculars yesterday. She was sitting in her kitchen window, wearing a short-sleeved cotton blouse. It was 12 below outside." Sarah wiped down the counter, her brow furrowing. "Maybe she has space heaters? Those electric radiators on the Oak Haven grid?" Mason scoffed. "If she had enough space heaters to melt the snow off her roof, she'd be tripping the valley's transformer every hour. Besides, I checked a meter on the pole outside her property line. The wheel is barely spinning." Sarah decided to see for herself. The following afternoon, she drove her postal jeep up the rutted, icy incline to Clara's cabin to deliver a package. As Sarah stepped onto the rotting wooden porch, she noticed there was no ice on the floorboards. She knocked. A moment later, the door swung open. A wall of heat hit Sarah's face, not the dry, smoky heat of a wood fire, but a thick, oppressive, almost tropical warmth. It smelled faintly of ozone and hot metal. Clara stood in the doorway, smiling politely, wearing a thin floral dress and barefoot. "Good afternoon, Sarah," Clara said softly, taking the package. Sarah stood shivering in her heavy down coat, her eyes darting past Clara into the cabin. The interior was Spartan: a bed, a small kitchenette, a rocking chair. There were no radiators, no vents, no roaring fire. Yet the temperature inside had to be hovering around 85 degrees. "Clara, aren't you freezing?" Sarah stammered, stating the obvious paradox. "Oh, I run a little hot," Clara smiled, a polite but firm dismissal in her eyes. "Thank you for the mail. Drive safe on that ice." She closed the door, leaving Sarah standing in the freezing cold, utterly bewildered. By January, the rumors in Oak Haven had evolved from curious whispers to wild accusations. The isolation of winter breeds paranoia, and Clara Hayes had become the town's primary fixation. Some claim she was running a high-grade illicit drug laboratory, cooking methamphetamine, or cultivating exotic strains of marijuana. Others, leaning into local folklore, suggested the cabin was built over a hidden geothermal hot spring that only Clara knew about. Mason Paul, however, suspected something far more practical and dangerous. He believed she was tapping directly into the valley's high-voltage mainline, bypassing the meter, and hoarding electricity for some industrial purpose. Mason's paranoia reached a boiling point when his own pipes froze during a brutal cold snap, while he could clearly see the heat waves shimmering in the air above Clara's roofless snow. He drove into town and demanded a meeting with Sheriff Boyd Mitchell. Sheriff Mitchell was a pragmatic man who didn't like harassing elderly women based on a neighbor's jealousy. But the persistent rumors of a drug lab gave him enough probable cause for a wellness check. Mitchell drove his cruiser up Pine Ridge Road on a Tuesday afternoon. The snowbanks were 6 feet high, but Clara's driveway was completely clear. It hadn't been shoveled, the snow had simply melted away the moment it touched the gravel. Mitchell knocked. Clara opened the door. The blast of heat hit the sheriff, instantly fogging his sunglasses. "Afternoon, Mom. Just doing a routine check, making sure everyone is surviving the freeze," Mitchell said, removing his glasses and wiping them on his jacket. "I'm quite fine, Sheriff," Clara said. "Mind if I step inside? It's awfully cold out here." Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of tension crossing her jaw before stepping aside. "Be my guest." Mitchell stepped in. The heat was overwhelming. He immediately began unzipping his heavy-duty coat. He looked around. No grow lights. No chemical smells. No strange equipment. Just an old woman's tidy Spartan living space. "Awfully warm in here, Miss Hayes. How are you heating the place?" "Insulation, Sheriff. Good insulation and body heat," she replied smoothly. Mitchell wasn't stupid. He looked down. The linoleum floor was warm beneath his boots. It wasn't just warm, it was vibrating. A very faint, almost imperceptible hum resonated through the floorboards, traveling up through his soles. It felt like standing on the deck of a ship with an engine running deep below in the hull. "Is there a basement down there?" Mitchell asked, pointing to the floor. "A crawl space," Clara corrected. "Just dirt and foundational pillars. It's sealed off to keep the drafts out." Mitchell didn't have a warrant. He couldn't tear up her floorboards. He tipped his hat, told her to stay safe, and left. But as he walked around the perimeter of the cabin back to his cruiser, he noticed a heavy-duty commercial exhaust grate hidden behind a large pine bush at the back of the foundation. It was blowing out air so hot, it felt like a commercial laundry dryer. The climax arrived on February 14th during a storm the locals would later dub the Valentine's Day Blizzard. A massive squall line stalled over the Bitterroot Valley, dropping 4 feet of snow in 24 hours and bringing winds of 60 miles per hour. At 9 p.m., the unthinkable happened. The main transformer station down in the valley blew out in a shower of blue sparks. The entire town of Oak Haven was plunged into darkness. In his home, Mason Paul scrambled to light his kerosene lanterns and stoke his fire. Without electricity to run the blower fans on his stove, the far corners of his house immediately began to freeze. He sat in his armchair, wrapped in blankets, staring out the window into the pitch-black, howling storm. Then he saw it. Through the blinding snow, a quarter-mile up the ridge, a soft, ambient glow emanated from Clara Hayes' cabin. It wasn't the flickering light of candles or lanterns. It was the steady, brilliant white light of high-efficiency LEDs. Mason's blood boiled. The entire county was dark, freezing, and terrified, yet Clara had power. She's tapped the main trunk line, Mason thought. She's stealing the grid's reserve. Driven by a mix of freezing desperation and vindictive rage, Mason grabbed his flashlight, bundled into his heaviest gear, and began the brutal trek up the hill. The wind tore at him, threatening to push him off the road. It took him 45 minutes to cover the distance. When he reached her property line, he didn't go to the front door. He bypassed the porch, wading through the deep drifts toward the back of the house, heading straight for the spot where the snow was melted down to the mud. He found a heavy, reinforced steel stone door set into the ground, a cellar entrance that had been carefully concealed beneath a false wooden deck. The deck had been pushed aside. Mason gripped the frozen handle of the steel door and yanked. It was unlocked. He descended a concrete stairwell, the air growing exponentially hotter with every step. The hum he had felt on her porch was now a deafening mechanical roar. He reached the bottom, pushed open a secondary fire door, and stepped into the impossible. Mason stood frozen, staring at a space that was entirely disproportionate to the tiny cabin above. A massive subterranean bunker, lined with concrete and steel, stretched out beneath the property. It wasn't a drug lab, it wasn't a geothermal spring. The room was filled with row upon row of towering black metal server racks. Thousands of blinking green and blue lights danced in the dim space. Thick, anaconda-sized bundles of black cabling snaked across the ceiling and floor, connecting the racks to a massive industrial cooling system that was struggling to keep the temperature down. The heat generated by the massive computing power was staggering. It was a localized inferno bleeding up through the ceiling to heat the cabin above. "You shouldn't be down here, Mason." Mason spun around. Clara Hayes stood at the base of the stairs. The frail, silver-haired woman was no longer smiling. In her hands, held with terrifying, steady competence, was a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. What is this?" Mason gasped over the roar of the cooling fans. "Are you mining Bitcoin? Are you stealing the town's power for this?" "I don't care about cryptocurrency, Mason," Clara said, her voice cutting clearly through the mechanical din. "And I'm not stealing Oak Haven's power. I'm tapped into the old ironclad timber subterranean hydroelectric line, the one the county forgot to decommission in 1998. It runs straight from the dam up in the pass." Mason stared at the blinking servers. "Then what is all this? Why the secrecy?" Clara lowered the shotgun by an inch, her eyes hardening with a profound, unshakable grief. "My son's name was Thomas," she said, her voice echoing off the concrete. "He was a senior data architect for Vanguard Therapeutics in Seattle. 5 years ago, he discovered that their flagship trial drug, the one approved for pediatric leukemia, was causing fatal neurological degradation in 30% of the children who took it. The executive knew. They buried the data to protect their stock price." Mason stood speechless, the oppressive heat of the room making him sweat beneath his parka. Thomas downloaded the unredacted clinical trials. The raw data, Clara continued, stepping further into the room. He was going to go to the FDA. The night before he was scheduled to testify, his car was forced off a bridge into Puget Sound. The police called it black ice. Vanguard Therapeutics wiped his office servers the next morning. She gestured to the massive wrecks of humming machines. "They thought they erased it all. But Thomas was paranoid. He mailed me an encrypted hard drive. It took me 3 years to learn how to build this, to learn how to bypass the grid, to learn how to host a decentralized, untraceable shadow network." "What are they doing?" Mason asked, pointing a trembling finger at the machines. "They are running a brute force decryption protocol on Thomas's files, while simultaneously seeding the data across 10,000 dark web nodes globally," Clara said, a fierce, protective pride in her voice. "The encryption Vanguard used is military grade. It takes immense processing power. Howard generates heat. For the last 6 months, this bunker has been running at maximum capacity. I've been living above a furnace." Mason looked at the woman. She wasn't a witch, a thief, or a drug kingpin. She was a mother burning the world down to avenge her son. Suddenly, a distinct high-pitched chime echoed from a central terminal at the back of the room. The deafening roar of the servers began to pitch down. The thousands of blinking lights suddenly flashed a solid, unified green. Clara turned toward the terminal, tears welling in her eyes. She lowered the shotgun completely. "It's done," she whispered. "The decryption is finished. The upload is complete. Every major news outlet, the FDA, the SEC, they all have it." Mason watched as the formidable woman suddenly looked incredibly small, the weight of a 5-year war finally dropping from her shoulders. They'll trace the upload eventually, Mason said softly, stepping toward her. When the power company realizes the dam is drawing this much juice, they'll come looking. The feds will come. I know, Clara said, wiping her face. She walked over to a heavy breaker box on the wall. That's why I'm leaving. She pulled the master switch. With a dying groan, the massive servers powered down. The lights went black. The deafening hum faded into total silence. Almost instantly, the bitter cold of the Montana blizzard began to seep through the concrete walls, reclaiming the space. When Sheriff Mitchell finally made it up Pine Ridge Road 2 days later, after the plows cleared the snow, he found Clara Hayes's cabin abandoned. The front door was unlocked. The interior was freezing, the thermometer on the wall reading a harsh 10 degrees. There was a thin layer of frost on the windows. Mitchell walked the property. He found the storm cellar door, but when he opened it, he found nothing but an empty, echoing concrete basement. The walls were scarred where heavy racks had been hurriedly dismantled and dragged away. The only thing left behind was a single split log resting by the front door, a silent joke left for the town. Mason Paul never said a word to the sheriff, nor to Sarah Jenkins. When the national news broke the following week, a massive leak of corporate documents leading to the arrest of Vanguard Therapeutics' entire executive board, Mason sat in his rocking chair by his wood stove, sipping his coffee. He looked out his window, up the hill. Claire's cabin sat dark, cold, and buried under 3 feet of snow, finally blending in perfectly with the brutal Montana winter.